Well, thank you very much for that very warm welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here speaking at this conference. I have to say, as a former whistleblower, I always see journalism conferences as a sort of target market. It's like shooting fish in a barrel, so thank you for coming along. Normally at this stage of a conference, I would also say that if there's any of our little friends from the secret services in the audience, you can turn off any recording devices because I'm not going to be saying anything illegal today for a change. Of course, this is a high-tech investigative journalism conference, so that request is probably a little bit futile. But anyway, I'm not going to be breaking any laws today. So, yes, what I wanted to do today, I have the luxury of quite a long period of time just to talk through a bit of my history, what it was like to work for MI5 in the UK and to blow the whistle and go on the run and face court cases, but then pull back from that personal experience to looking at some of the lessons I learnt during that period about how the spies, how the intelligence community can influence and manipulate the media, and also what we can do about this, and also what can happen if you get a whistleblower falling into your lap and offering you an exclusive story, how you can protect them, and what the role of the media is in that process. So just to start off with, as was mentioned in the introduction, I used to work for MI5, which is the UK Domestic Security Service. That used to get truncated down at conferences where they had their little name tags in front of them to UKSS, until some bright spark realised that it might have the wrong connotations for some of our German colleagues. Although perhaps now looking at the situation that MI5 is working in, it's not that far off. Anyway, that's a different story. In the UK, we have three main spy agencies. It's a very sort of British muddle that's evolved historically over the decades. So we have MI5 doing the internal security. We have MI6, or the Secret Intelligence Service, which is a sort of James Bond wannabes. They tend to go around the world trying to hoover up intelligence. And then we also have the Government Listening Post, GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, which is based down in Cheltenham. Now, that's very like the American NSA, and they work incredibly closely with the NSA. But we also have a bewildering array of sort of second-tier spy agencies as well. Every police force in the UK has its own secret police section called Special Branch. And then we have customs and we have revenues. And we also have military intelligence, which of course is the oldest joke on the planet, the oldest oxymoron on the planet. So there's all these sort of competing different little agencies, all treading on each other's toes, all trying to get the same sort of information, and all competing for prestige and resources from the government. So there's not a lot of collaboration going on between all the agencies. A lot of information can be lost between the cracks. Now, MI5 and MI6 celebrated their centenary last year, but for the first 80 years of their existence, they didn't actually officially exist. So they worked very much in the shadows. There was no law covering their actions. And even our elected MPs were not allowed to ask questions about what they got up to. And this led to a sort of environment where they pretty much did what they wanted. One famous 1980s whistleblower, Peter Wright, who wrote a very famous book called Spycatcher, actually described the process as, in the heyday, as they could go around London bugging and burgling with impunity. Now, this all changed a little bit in the 1980s, because there was a series of scandals. Both Peter Wright and a number of other whistleblowers came out, which led to a reform of how these services had to work. And in 1989, the Security Service Act was put in place to regulate MI5. And then in 1994, the Intelligence Service Act came into being to regulate MI6 and GCHQ. Now, this meant they could continue to do what they'd always done, but they had to do it within the framework of these laws. So if they wanted to do something illegal, like break into our homes and plant a bug, or look at our communications, listen to our telephone calls, they had to get prior written permission of their political masters, either the Home Secretary in MI5's case, or the Foreign Secretary in the case of MI6 or GCHQ. Now, this is quite crucial because when they approached me to work for them as an intelligence officer, they had just been put on a legal footing. They were now obliged to work within the law, because if they'd come to me any earlier, I would have said, no way, I'm not going to have anything to do with you. And just to roll back, I was recruited in 1990, started working there at the beginning of 1991. And I'd never actually wanted to be a spy. I was never a spy geek when I was younger. But I wanted to be a diplomat instead. I quite fancied the idea of swanning around embassy parties, swilling champagne and things. In fact, it turns out that they don't have champagne, they have cheap white plonk, but, that's another story. But I applied to the Foreign Office, and I had this letter a couple of months later on Ministry of Defence notepaper. And it said very obliquely that there may be other jobs I would find more interesting. And I don't know why, but my very, very first gut instinct response was, oh my God, it's MI5, which is a strange response to have. And I was really frightened at the prospect. Why the hell would they be interested in me? Why on earth would they approach me to do their dirty work? I mean, they had a really bad reputation after all these scandals in the 1980s. So I was going to ignore it. I mean, all they said was, here's a telephone number. If you're interested, please ring up. I was going to ignore this approach. Unfortunately, I opened the letter in the same room as my father, who was a spy geek, who loved all the sort of John le Carré novels and everything, and also, crucially, was an investigative journalist. So you can imagine his response was, oh, please, just ring up, see if it is MI5, please. So, of course, years further down the line, after all the whistleblowing and the scandal and everything, every time he used to complain about it, I'd just say, well, look, Dad, it was your fault. You're the one who encouraged me to ring them up in the first place. It's always good to be able to blame your parents. Anyway, I rang up the number, and a couple of months later found myself sitting in this anonymous office block in the centre of London, completely empty of anything, apart from this one woman who started interviewing me. And she grilled me about my life from the age of about 12 onwards. I mean, anything and everything. Ethics, politics, religion, whatever. And about halfway through this process, she pushed a piece of paper across the table, and she looked at me and she said, why do you think you're here? And it was at this point I thought, oh, God, do I say, are you MI5? Because, I mean, if I got it wrong, I'd look like a complete fool. And I said, well, are you MI5? She said, yes, we are. Can you please sign this notification of the Official Secrets Act? You can't tell anyone what's going on from here or forth. So I signed, and the interview carried on. And then I got called back for more stages. And it's a very intensive recruitment process. It goes on for months. You have to go through different exercises and group exercises and interviews and psychiatric tests and everything. And I was very open and very honest, completely open and honest, because, of course, they were MI5. I thought they knew everything about me. So there were no little sort of holes in my CV, in my resume, that I just sort of glided over. And I was very open and honest about my views as well, about my ethical framework. And, we were grilled about issues like, what do you think of internment of terrorist suspects or torture or whatever? And my views then are the same as my views are now, more of which later. And they still kept inviting me back to the next stage. So I thought, gradually, actually, yes, perhaps I am right for this job. It took about 10 months in all to get recruited. And the one thing they also said was that they were after a new generation of intelligence officers. Because up until the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, their primary focus had been counter-espionage, of course, and counter-subversion, which was investigating left-wing subversive political activists within the UK. But they said, well, that's all in the past now. We need a new type of intelligence officer because we're taking on new work, which is counter-terrorism, particularly lead in the investigation into the provisional IRA on the UK mainland. And that, of course, involves a very different range of skills from those you would use to investigate sort of slow-moving political targets. Suddenly you're in the midst of a very fast-paced counter-terrorism type investigation where you're supposed to gather evidence and put people on trial and all that sort of thing. Well, in those days that was the case. Now, of course, you just black bag them and send them off somewhere. So I got through this process quite reassured that actually they had been maligned by the press. They did work within the law, and they were now going to be working against terrorism. So as they say in all good fiction, imagine my surprise when I first walked into the building in January 1991 to find that I'd been posted to the counter-subversion section. First indication, you might think, that they weren't telling the whole truth. But I was there for 2 years. When you work as an intelligence officer, your role, basically, you are assigned an area to investigate, and then you have to identify people of interest within that area. And then you have an array of different tools you can use to investigate them. It's a bit like journalism, apart from, of course, in MI5, you can bug their phones legally, if you do it properly. But also you can run in human agents into that group to get reports back on what they're doing. You can intercept all their other communications. You can plant bugs in their property, in their car, whatever. So you have to deploy these tools, and then you get all the information coming back to you, which you then have to analyse and decide what to do with. And you have every 2 years you get reposted. So for the first 2 years I was working in the political section, counter-subversion. Then I was moved to Irish terrorism, and then finally I finished up in international terrorism. And it was in my first posting that I met my former partner and former colleague. It was a man called David Shaler, who became a very well-known, notorious whistleblower in the late 1990s. And it was in F2, this is what the first section was called, it was called F2, the counter-subversion section, that we saw a whole array of interesting files coming out of the registry of MI5, because it gave us a very sort of good overview of the history of what they had got up to, the sheer scale of how much they had investigated UK citizens for their political activity, for their political beliefs over the previous decades. They had about 1 million files in the MI5 registry. Most of those were purely for political activity. And you could get an MI5 file for something as simple as being a friend of someone who might be a sympathiser of the Communist Party of Great Britain. So you'd be categorised as a query sympathiser with. But also we saw other strange files coming out of the registry as well. I mean, there was one schoolboy who got a file with MI5 because he had written into the Communist Party HQ asking for information for an essay he was writing for a school project. It was that crazy. But more seriously, there were other aspects that did trouble us even then, because I was in the section in the run-up to a UK general election in 1992. Now, in those days, anyone who stood to be an MP had their name cross-referenced against the MI5 database. If they had a file, that file was pulled up, that file was reviewed, and a report sent to their political party leader, just in case they got elected and just in case they ended up in government. Of course, you don't want someone as a rampant communist in those days sort of taking on the defence ministry or something. Anyway, we saw a whole range of files coming out of registry in 1992, and none of them were particularly interesting at that time. But they then, of course, all went on to become leading members of the Labour government when they were elected in the landslide in 1997. So we're talking MI5 holding files on people from Tony Blair down. I mean, Tony Blair, Jack Straw, Robin Cook, Peter Mandelson, Harriet Harman. You think of anyone who was anyone during the Labour administration, they pretty much had an MI5 file. Now, you know, it's hard to imagine that any of that crowd could ever have been radical enough, left-wingers, to have been a threat to national security at any point in their lives. But they did have files. And I think this is a problem, particularly for democracy, where you have these people, and people like Jack Straw, Tony Blair, and Robin Cook ended up as the political masters in charge of the spies. And yet they have files held on them by the spies. And I think that's a real problem democratically. It's a sort of tail-wagging-the-dog situation. And it always did make me wonder, as I was watching the Labour government pushing yet more resources and powers and everything else to the spies, if they were doing it out of fear. Anyway, as I said, there were 2 more postings. The next one was the Irish section, looking at the provisional IRA in the UK mainland. And I won't dwell too long on that, but again, we saw a number of things going wrong, including 2 bomb attacks that could and should have been prevented. One was the infamous Bishopsgate bombing in 1993 in the City of London. Huge, great lorry bomb went off. 1 person was killed, and the attack cost about £350 million worth of insurance payouts, which I think was more than had ever been paid out through the entire course of the Civil War in Northern Ireland. So it was a huge publicity coup for the provisional IRA. But it could have been prevented, but there was a mistake. But crucially, MI5 then covered up that mistake. When they wrote their official report to the government about what had gone on, they lied. And when David Shaler said, well, you know, you shouldn't be doing this, shouldn't we not tell them that we made a mistake, but we've learnt from that mistake? He was just told to shut up and not rock the boat. So every time politicians in the UK come out and say, oh, we know what the spies are doing, of course we do. They don't. The spies can lie, and they have no way of finding out. It was in the final section, though, in G branch, which was international terrorism, that we saw the things that made us really question what we were doing, working in the British intelligence community. And there were 3 cases. First of all, there was a case of a well-known left-wing journalist. She was the deputy foreign editor of The Guardian newspaper in the UK, a woman called Victoria Britton. And she was subject to an illegal telephone intercept for half a year. And the reason that she was bugged was because she had links to a Nigerian diplomat who had tangential links to the Libyan regime. Now, the Nigerian diplomat was paying large sums of money into Victoria Britton's London bank account. And MI5 got terribly excited about this, saying, she must be money laundering for the Libyan regime, this is great. It's the biggest case on the Libyan desk for a decade. Well, apart from Lockerbie. It's the biggest case on the Libyan desk for a decade. It turned out that it was entirely innocent. She was actually just holding money for the Nigerian who was using that money to pay for a libel case in the UK courts. But MI5 didn't bother to check this out. They just knee-jerk slapped on a telephone intercept and wasted, I think, about £750,000 as well in running that operation until it was stopped because it was illegal. Worse, though, One bright spark had the idea of actually planting a bug in her home in London, a property bug. And to do this, when they send the team in and they break into the flat and bury the bug somewhere, they want to make sure that they have all the people who have keys to that flat under control. So they're called the key holders. And one of the people who had a key to Victoria Britten's house was her daughter. Now, she happened to be in America at the time of the operation, but that wasn't good enough for MI5. They thought, well, she might fly back, and, it'll only take her 10 hours. I mean, we've got to have her under control while we're doing this operation. So they actually came up with a scheme and asked the FBI in America to arrest her on trumped-up charges and hold her in prison while they broke into her mother's flat illegally in London to plant this bug. You couldn't make it up. So that was the first thing in G Branch. There are another two cases. One was the bombing of the Israeli embassy in London in 1994. And this was a car bomb, a very sophisticated car bomb, that was driven out and parked outside the embassy, and it exploded. Very, very sophisticated bomb as well, because it managed to eat up its own forensic traces. Even the IRA, in the height of its campaigning, couldn't make bombs that good. And there was a massive investigation. Lots of Palestinian students were rounded up by the police, and in fact, two were charged, tried, and convicted of conspiracy to cause that explosion. They had alibis for the day of the attack, but they were done for conspiracy, and they both got 20-year sentences, despite the fact they always proclaimed they were innocent. And indeed, it turned out that it looked like they were, because MI5, the chief investigating officer, whose James Bond number was G91, who'd seen all the evidence and all the intelligence, crucially, around this case, wrote his official end of investigation report. And his view was that Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, had carried out the bombing itself. Now, you read this on the internet and you think, wild conspiracy theory. But this, as I said, was the senior investigating officer and his official report. And he assessed that they'd done this for two reasons. One, the Israelis were always hassling MI5 for increased protection around their interests in London. Of course, London was a sort of bit of a seething haven of Islamist terrorists in the 1990s and is well named as Londonistan. So they were always convinced that they were under imminent attack, but MI5 never saw any sign that they were about to be attacked, so would not raise the protection levels. So, of course, if they let off a controlled explosion, a very sophisticated, very clever explosion in which nobody died, immediately they get the extra protection they wanted. But crucially, the other reason was that the Palestinian students were involved in a support network, a political network, trying to fight for the rights of people in Gaza and the left bank. And they were gaining some traction at that time. But of course, once you get the police operation rounding them all up and convicting two of them, the whole network just shattered and hasn't got back to its feet, on its feet to this day. So the poor victims, Samar Alami was a young woman, and Jawad Botmeh was the young man involved. Both actually served out most of their sentences. They were only released about 3 years ago, despite the fact MI5, in its formal assessment, said that they thought they were innocent. The final case I just want to touch on from the MI5 years, though, and this was the case that made us quit. This is why we resigned and why we decided to go public with our concerns about what was going on in this secret organisation. And this became known as the Gaddafi plot when it was printed in the newspapers. And in this, I mean, it seems quite quaint talking about this now after what's happened in Libya this year. But in 1995, MI6 paid an Islamic extremist group in Libya a large sum of money in order to carry out a coup attempt against Gaddafi and to try and assassinate him. Now, again, this sounds like some sort of mad conspiracy theory, but what happened was David at that time was working in G Branch, G9C5, I think he was, and he was the head of the Libyan section. And he built up an incredibly close working relationship with his counterpart in MI6, which was unusual because MI6 and MI5 normally hate each other and compete against each other and don't talk to each other. And they probably don't now after this. Anyway, so he became quite close to his MI6 counterpart, who was PT16B. Nice James Bond number, that one. And he was briefed throughout 1996 about this unfolding plot, officially briefed. So PT16B said there had been a volunteer, a walk-in, from the Libyan military agencies, and he had approached the British embassy in Tunis asking for help. He said he wanted to speak to the resident spy, because MI6 officers always work as diplomats. So he spoke to the resident spy and said, we have a cunning plan. I have a ragtag group of Islamic extremists in Libya who I can use to topple Gaddafi. But what we need is help. We need the financial help in order to buy the equipment. Not just the jeeps and the tents for the camp, but also the equipment to carry out the attack. Now, David was briefed about this, and he initially dismissed it. Oh, it's just another James Bond sort of fantasy thing that MI6 is always coming up with these mad plans. But actually, they pushed ahead with it. And the source, the walk-in, who was then codenamed Tumworth, met his handler in MI6 across Europe about 3 or 4 more times over the next few months. And on each occasion, MI6 gave him about $40,000. David, as I said, didn't think anything was going to happen of this. But come late February, early March 1996, he was sitting at his desk in MI5, and suddenly all these intelligence reports started appearing from different sources, saying there had indeed been an attack. And what had happened was Colonel Gaddafi had been to the Libyan People's Congress in Sirte and was driving back in a cavalcade of cars back to Tripoli. Of course, you know, the crowds are waving as he goes past. And an explosion had taken place, had occurred under a car. Manifestly the wrong car because Gaddafi survived. But obviously the people in that car were killed and more bystanders in the ensuing security shootout. And I think it was estimated that 11 people died that day. So the next time David saw PT-16B, he said, well, you know, is this what you were talking about? And he said, apparently, with a note of triumph in his voice, yes, we did it. That was our man. Apart from, obviously, they hadn't done it because Gaddafi was still very much alive. Now, this operation was not only unethical and very reckless and a very volatile part of the world. Crucially, under the 1994 Intelligence Services Act, which governs MI6, it was illegal under UK law too. Because under the ISA, if MI6 wants to do something illegal, but gets the prior written permission of its political master, the Foreign Secretary, then it has legal immunity to do so. They didn't in this case. So we're looking at an illegal operation to assassinate illegally a foreign head of state, which goes wrong and kills more innocent people. I mean, there was nothing that we could think of really more heinous than this. Now, what to do when you're faced with that? I mean, all through the years, we had raised our concerns with our bosses while we were on the inside, as had many of our peer group who also had similar concerns and who were also resigning in great numbers at the time. Under the Official Secrets Act, which is the law that protects the spy agencies, there is no avenue that you can go to outside the agencies without breaking the law. The only person you can go to is the head of the agency you want to accuse of committing a crime. So you can imagine how far those sort of complaints get. You can't even go to the police, you can't go to the MPs, nothing, without technically breaking the law. So David, who had some experience as a journalist, actually, before he became a spook, decided perhaps the best way to actually try and affect change would be to go public with these concerns and push for an inquiry, get a real media storm up, and then there would be pressure on the government to hold an inquiry into what the spies were doing, and then hopefully push for change. So this meant that we ended up having to resign from MI5. We ended up deciding to go to the newspapers, and then it ended up literally on the run around Europe. So we resigned in 1996, and just before we resigned, David actually did approach a newspaper and start the whole thing rolling. And he chose the newspaper, which was the Mail on Sunday, which is a British right-wing sort of mid-market newspaper, mainly because the editor had a reputation as a really good, hardcore investigative journalist of the old school. And also, crucially, the proprietor of the newspaper group was a man called Lord Rothermere, who was known to be very anti the intelligence agencies because apparently they destroyed the reputation of one of his friends or something. So, I mean, that was a good indicator that this newspaper group would fight for us. Anyway, so he approached the newspaper. He took some documents as well to prove what he was saying. And then we resigned. We left in late 1996. And then there was this incredibly long, painful courtship process, really, between David and the newspaper, the journalists, because obviously the newspaper were worried it was going to be some sort of sting operation by MI5 or something. And he was very worried that the newspaper could shop him to MI5 and he'd end up in prison with no, exposure. So it was a very sort of slow courtship, and for the first few months, the newspaper only knew him as Mike. That was his sort of alias for some reason. Anyway, eventually they developed some trust, and roll forward to 1997, the summer of 1997, finally, they decide to break the stories, or at least some of the stories. They didn't go with the Gaddafi plot up front, because they just thought it was so huge, they wanted to do more investigation into it. So we had 3 days warning. After all this build-up, all this waiting, all this tension, all this paranoia that MI5 might be investigating us, suddenly we had a phone call. David went into the office to talk to the editor, and then he was told we had 3 days warning before the story broke. And he the editor said, well, what do you want to do? David said, well, actually, I'd quite like to go abroad just for a little while, while the heat simmers down a bit. In the end, we were away for about 3 years, but, you can never predict these things. And then the editor said, well, do you need a bit of money to survive while you're abroad? So at that point, he offered David some expenses to do this too. Anyway, we had 3 days warning, and then we just did a flit. We ran. We went, in fact, to the Netherlands to begin with, and then moved around Europe in this sort of surreal sort of backpacking summer holiday, moving from hotel to hotel, and, with MI5 on our tail, and only using cash, using fake names, everything like that. It was actually more like being a spy than it was when you were working for the agencies. So the story broke June 1997, and inevitably, the government played it the way we had hoped they would. There was a huge scandal, particularly as most of the first stories were about the files on government ministers, which really worried them. So there was a huge scandal, and then the government did what we expected the government to do. The knee-jerk reaction of all governments is to slap an injunction on the media. The whole national media was injuncted, and David Shayler personally was injuncted. And of course the media got really, really angry then, saying, but we're the free press, how dare you gag us, this is all public interest. And we all thought, this is great. Fab, we've got the media behind us, we're going to have this sort of support and pressure for an inquiry. And that Saturday night, we went to bed and slept for about the first time in about a month. Phew, all the tension had gone. And we woke up the next morning to find that the headlines across the world's media were Princess Diana had died in Paris that night. Which you can't really factor into your plans when you're trying to take on the British government. So we found ourselves lost in Europe, no media coverage, no media support, no media help and pressure. What to do? Well, indeed, it was uphill ever after that. I decided to go back to the UK at that point because in the interim as well, the secret police, the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, had been sent into our home in London where they conducted a counter-terrorism style search. So they'd ripped it apart, literally. The floorboards were up, the carpets, the furniture was smashed. They even pulled the bath pipes out and the bath apart. God knows what they were looking for. So I knew that I needed to go back, 1, to sort that out, 2, to talk to all the lawyers, and 3, also to try and sort out our traumatised families, because we'd been so paranoid before the story broke, we couldn't even phone them up and say what was going on, because obviously we thought we might be bugged. So I went back, knowing I'd be arrested, purely for being Shayler's girlfriend at that time. I hadn't actually said anything, really. And lo and behold, I got arrested as I walked through immigration in Gatwick Airport. I was whisked off to a terrorism interview suite in the central London police station and grilled for 6 hours. And they let me go. They never charged me with anything, although they kept me on police bail for the next 6 months, so I had to keep going back to the UK to answer the bail. But worse than that, they also, 2 days later, in coordinated dawn raids, also kicked in the doors and arrested David's brother and his 2 best friends on trumped-up charges, and never charged them with anything either, but kept them on police bail. So I think it's a way of trying to keep David in his box, a sort of control mechanism. Anyway, after that, after I was let out of the prison and sorted out our smashed-up home, I returned to France, where David had found this little remote French farmhouse, and we hid there for 10 months. And during that time, we kept, with our lawyer, who was the head of Liberty, the Civil Liberties Union in the UK, we were negotiating with the government, saying, look, we've got all this information, all this evidence of really serious crimes. Please let us back to the UK without being prosecuted, take the evidence and investigate it. We didn't think it was that, unusual to ask for something like that. But they didn't want that to happen. They wanted us just to rot abroad. So in frustration, come the summer of 1998, David went back to the newspapers, the Mail on Sunday, the Sunday Times, and he also did a big special interview with BBC's Panorama programme about the Gaddafi plot. And they submitted this to the government for clearance, for airing, under the terms of the injunction. And we were in Paris with the journalists, and within 2 hours of that submission, suddenly there were urgent extradition requests flying around across the channel between the British government and the French government, saying, this man, he's a traitor, he's selling secrets to the enemy powers, you've got to arrest him and extradite him. It's funny how they conflate the media with enemy powers, but anyway. So that was that. The French had to do what the British asked. And David was scooped up off the street as he was coming back to our hotel, disappeared into the system. Even his lawyer couldn't find him for a few days in the French legal system. And then he was kept under very stringent secrecy laws for about 2 months, because the British, as I said, had said he was a traitor. However, once the paperwork arrived and the French saw what he was accused of, they just said, "Pah," pretty much. This guy blew the whistle. Blowing the whistle, being a whistleblower, is deemed to be a political offence under French law, and we do not extradite for political offences. Simple. So after almost 4 months in prison, he was just released. So that was that. I mean, we were sort of then in France. He couldn't leave France at that point because they would have tried to extradite him again. But we had another 2 years there, and we abandoned our little French farmhouse. We went to live in Paris. And I have to say, if you ever have to go on the run, if you ever have to live in exile, Paris is the place to be. Fits all the cliches. And from there, we kept pushing the story and the other information out as much as we could. I mean, it was a big scandal that rumbled on for years in the British media. And during that time, crucially, a document emerged from MI6, it was leaked, which did pretty much stand up the Gaddafi plot. So there was, again, a big media storm. Come on, we must have an inquiry into these allegations, blah, blah, blah. And the Foreign Office at the time said, we have nothing to add or subtract to our previous statements about this, which is it's pure fantasy, even though there was this document now out there. And also as well, another intelligence officer from MI5 came out in our support, which was great. It was very brave of him. But it was interesting watching how that process worked, because the story was due to be the big front page headline on the Guardian newspaper one day. And just coincidentally, the day before, the memoirs of the former head of MI5, Dame Stella Rimington, happened to be leaked from the Cabinet Office to the Guardian newspaper. So that became the big spy front page story, and Jeston was pushed off. So it was interesting watching how the media could be manipulated like that. So that was that, really. After about 2 years, we'd taken it as far as we could from France. David was desperate to try and get proper recognition for the Gaddafi plot issue. So he decided to return voluntarily to the UK. And he knew he'd be arrested. He knew he'd be charged and tried under the Official Secrets Act. But he returned voluntarily in August 2000. Now, he was never charged, curiously, with any of the more serious disclosures, like the Gaddafi plot, or the Israeli embassy bombing, or the Victoria Britain case. He was only ever charged with the very early disclosures from summer 1997, the pretty low-level things. So he assumed that at that point, the police would have done their investigation. He would have a quick trial. It would be over in a year. Didn't quite work out like that, because he didn't get in front of a jury in the Old Bailey courtrooms until October 2002. So it was over 2 years waiting for trial. And during that time, the government took him through this whole series of pre-trial hearings about what he could say in court once he got in front of a jury. And every legal ruling narrowed it down and narrowed it down and narrowed it down, so that when it came to the trial, he wasn't allowed to say anything in his own defence. He couldn't say why he'd done what he did. He couldn't breathe the words Gaddafi plot, because that would have been contempt of court. And, in fact, even when he wanted to cross-examine the witnesses in his case, the prosecution witnesses, he had to write out his questions, hand them to the judge and the prosecuting lawyer for vetting, in case it damaged national security. He blurted out something in the courtroom. And they would cross all the questions out, so he couldn't even freely cross-examine his accusers. So it was a bit of a show trial, and inevitably he was convicted. Luckily, his sentence wasn't too heavy. He was facing up to 6 years in prison, but after a mitigation plea and all the rest, it was taken down to 6 months. But I think actually what was worse in the process wasn't just having to do a bit of time inside. It was also the shredding of the reputation by some of the quiescent media in the UK. So, for example, the formal ruling at the end of the court case, read out by the judge to the journalist, said something along the lines of, Mr. Shaler did what he did in the public interest, there was no financial motivation, and no agent lives were ever put at risk by his whistleblowing. And this was the formal ruling. And the journalists were there. I was watching them write it all down. So, again, imagine my surprise. I really must stop being so surprised in my life. Imagine my surprise when I looked at the headlines the next day, and they said pretty much the opposite, which was, Shaler sells agent lives down the river for money. I used to think, hang on, was I in a different courtroom listening to a different ruling? So that, the ruin of his reputation, in fact, was harder because it had longer-term repercussions than just the conviction itself. Now, of course, this sort of got me looking and thinking at the intersection between the spies and the media, especially hearing some of the stories back from the other journalists who'd worked with our case and their experiences as well. So I do have a sort of certain fascination. I just want to talk a little bit about my understanding of the UK situation. And it might well be similar or worse than other countries across Europe, but it's quite stark in the UK. And some of the stories I heard back from the journalists working on this case were eyebrow-raising. The editor of the Mail on Sunday, the investigative journalist that we wanted to work with originally, was a guy called Jonathan Holborough. And when the story first broke, Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell, his notorious spin doctor, were immediately on the phone from Number 10, saying, what else are you going to publish? And Alistair Campbell was threatening to send round the heavies, as he called them, which is the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, to seize all their computers, all their notes, everything. And Holborough got summoned to 10 Downing Street by Blair for a one-to-one meeting. Interestingly, though, this really intrigued Jonathan, because Blair wouldn't talk to him inside the building. He insisted on taking him out to the back garden, where he started saying, what else does Shayla know? Come on, tell me, what else is he going to say? And, of course, this made Holborough think even Tony Blair is paranoid about being bugged by somebody in Downing Street. But there were other slightly sadder cases. One of the very good journalists who worked on our case was a man called Martin Bright. It was a man called Martin Bright, who was, at the time, the Home Affairs editor on the Observer newspaper. And he was great. I mean, he just really went for these stories, kept worrying at them and kept digging up more and more information. So inevitably, the government set the police on him. And again, threatened to send in the special branch to the Observer to take all their information and look through all their computer systems. And at one point, it looked like he was going to be hung out to dry by his newspaper. It was only when the National Union of Journalists stepped in and supported him that then the powers backed off a little bit. But he has had a rough ride since. It's not been so easy for him. And worse still, there was another man called James Steen, who edited a bi-weekly magazine called Punch, which is now defunct. And this was a sort of hardcore, investigative, slightly alternative news magazine. And he broke one of the IRA stories. In this case, it was the Bishopsgate story, where the bomb could have been prevented and it exploded and someone died and a huge amount of damage, and the government was lied to about this. Now, Steen worked with David on this story, and they produced a fantastic, very carefully written story which could not possibly cause any damage to national security, and sent it in for clearance under the terms of the injunction. And the government lawyers just stopped and slowed it down, stopped it. So Steen, in frustration, kept saying, look, I've got to go to print. This is my time when I go to print. Can I have the story back then? You've had weeks to look at this. And they just wouldn't give the story back. So he went ahead and published. And he got convicted for contempt of court for breaking the injunction by publishing this. And when the lawyers finally sent their redacted copy back, all that they wanted to take out was a piece of information saying, so-and-so, who was the suspect for this explosion, went on the run to Ireland. And they wanted that changed to so-and-so went over to Ireland. Don't ask me. Anyway, this guy got a conviction for publishing that without prior written permission. And one other case that struck me as completely over the top was that of a student journalist, a young woman called Julianne Davis, who was studying at Kingston University in London, and she was writing for her student newspaper. And, you know, a bit of oomph about her. She emailed David and said, can I come over and interview you in Paris? And David said yes, so she did, and they had a nice lunch. She got a nice story, went back to Kingston, went back to her course. And then one day she's sitting in her lecture theatre, and these heavies come in, it's Metropolitan Police Special Branch, who arrest her under the 1911 Official Secrets Act, which is there to stop treachery, not the 1989 Official Secrets Act, which is there to stop whistleblowing. She's hauled out of her lecture theatre, taken off to the terrorism suite, and interrogated. Her room's ripped apart, everything's taken away. She loses her place at university. Now, nobody to this day knows why they did this, what they suspected she might have done. And, of course, she sued the pants off the police for wrongful arrest, and rightly so. And she went on to become a very good journalist, writing for the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, strangely enough. But it turned her life inside out. So the press experiences around the Shayla case, just the ripple effect was interesting. And it was very, very noticeable that if the journalists were working for smaller publications, or they were independent or freelance, the full force of the media would hit them. If it was a big organisation, of course, the government was slightly warier because they had more lawyers and things. So where does that leave us in terms of the media and the spies? Well, with all that experience, and then looking at other whistleblowing cases that have come out, I would say that there's very much a sort of carrot and stick situation going on, certainly in the UK. The spies in the UK are the least accountable, but most legally protected of any intelligence agencies, I think, in any notional Western democracy. We have a situation now where the carrot aspect can be very seductive for journalists. And I'm sure many of you perhaps will have been on the receiving end of some of this type of treatment. But certainly the low-level aspect is inducting people into a sort of secret charm circle. So you have the intelligence agencies, and it also works with government and defence and with the spin doctors as well, of course, where you are reliant on briefings from these agencies because you can't really get much else out of them. So you are inducted into the secret charm circle where you get the briefings, and if you write up the briefings as they want you to, then you keep getting the material to write more stories. Of course, if you get the briefings, then do a bit of investigation and don't write what they want you to, you can be ejected from that secret charm circle and lose your access and lose the stories that you need to do your job. So that's just like sort of first level. But then in the UK, we also get this sense of taking you in a bit deeper as a journalist. You become an agent of influence, as they call it, where you're not just receiving briefings, you're slightly more active, where you can tip them off if an interesting and worrying story is coming into your media organisation. Someone else is doing some digging into something. Or where you can help to massage or spin a story that your newspaper or your media organisation is covering. And in fact, there was a very famous, very brave journalist in the UK called David Rose who came out into the public about 5 years ago and said, yes, this happened to me. I've been doing it for 10 years. Where he knew someone at college who went into the intelligence agencies. He became a journalist. They had a lunch. And, you know, they got chatting and he started just helping and doing what this friend suggested to him sometimes. He did it for 10 years. But as I said, he outed himself. I have to say, though, I haven't seen his byline too often since he bravely stepped up and said that, yes, I was an agent of influence. I had lunch as well with a grand old man of Fleet Street in the UK a few months ago, he's broken some of the most famous UK news stories over the last few decades. And we were talking about this sort of soft control of the media. And he said, oh, yes, dear, of course, we all knew about the agents of influence. You know, there are at least 2 in every media editorial room. You know, all the way through all the decades of working, we always knew who the 2 were. I don't know if you could say the same, but... So that's that sort of level as well. Even if you can resist all that, and you get a really shit-hot story, how can you guarantee it'll be published? Because, of course, the power controls go on at a higher level too, where you have this sort of, certainly in the UK with a famous British establishment, you have this sort of wining and dining of editors, of the newspaper proprietors, media proprietors even. And certainly we saw this in the UK in the 1990s after the Shaler whistleblowing. MI5 went on a real charm offensive. It set up a proper press office. It started inviting senior journalists, editors, proprietors to cosy lunches with the head of MI5. At that time, the Director General was called Stephen Lander, and he was not the most people-friendly person, shall we say. There was a very famous lunch, one of the very early ones, and Mark Urban, who was the BBC diplomatic editor at the time, who did the Panorama programme on the Gaddafi plot, went along to one of these early lunches. And he asked some question about the Gaddafi plot, and Lander apparently turned around and said something like, I'm not here to answer half-baked questions from smart-ass journalists. Which rather shows that when he was told to go on a charm offensive, he missed out the first bit of the word, of the phrase. So that goes on too. And, you know, it can also be meeting up in gentlemen's clubs in St. James and things like that. And, oh, really, you don't want to cover this guy's story. He's a fantasist. He's too low level. He's too junior to know what he's talking about. He's disgruntled or whatever. You can imagine how that works too. So that's the sort of the soft aspect of control. Oh, there is one other slightly more malign section as well in the UK. I don't know if this happens in other intelligence agencies, but MI6 has its very own press management section. And this isn't a press office, this is more malignant. This is something called Information Operations, or IOPS. And this department is there purely to manipulate the media, in terms of placing even fake stories in the media via tame journalists, or spinning stories to the benefit of the intelligence agencies. And there was a very famous case, again in the 1990s, where Colonel Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, the guy who I think is still alive and still on the run, wanted to come to the UK to study at the London School of Economics. And at that point, Libya was a priority 1 intelligence target, and MI6 didn't want the son of Gaddafi living it up in London. So they created a fake paper trail so that when MI5 came to assess his visa application, they would say, oh, no, we're not letting him in the country. And what they did was they phoned up one of their tame journalists on the Sunday Telegraph, which notoriously had very, very close links with MI6. In fact, the editor at the time was the brother-in-law of a very senior MI6 officer. So the linkages went there as well. And the journalist Con was shown some documents purporting to show that Saif al-Islam was money laundering money through Iran and Egypt and a few other countries. Now, the journalist wasn't allowed to take copies of these documents. He was told the people he was seeing presenting these documents were bankers. They weren't. They were MI6 officers undercover. Anyway, he had had a good working relationship with his MI6 before, so he printed the story. Saif al-Islam involved in dodgy money laundering. And then, of course, it's in the papers, it's copied by other papers, it becomes fact, it becomes true. So then, of course, MI5 starts looking at Saif al-Islam, saying, well, we can't let him in, he's a money launderer. And he's blocked from entering the UK. Then, of course, you get the whistleblower, David Shayler, coming forward and saying, this happened. So Saif al-Islam then decides to sue the Sunday Telegraph, of course. And he wins, of course. And he could have gone for exemplary damages, huge payout, but then decided not to. Interesting. And then just a couple of months later, suddenly he's allowed into the UK, suddenly he's allowed to go and study at the LSE, and Tony Blair helps him write his PhD, as we've now found out. And suddenly he makes a huge donation to the LSE for the privilege. I think it was £1.5 million, which actually I think makes the 9,000 they're charging the standard UK students look quite reasonable in my view. And this went on. Again, this was another example of how IOPS can plant literally fake information and then it becomes fact. So it's quite sort of worrying how that can all happen. So that's the sort of carrot, the backroom deals, the leverage that the spies can use. But we also have, as I said, them protected by a huge battery of laws. They are the most legally protected intelligence community in the Western world. And, I mean, the UK, starting from libel, I mean, the UK is known to be the libel capital of the world, tourism libel. We have even the Terrorism Act being used against journalists in the UK to try and make journalists give up their notes. Because the police will go to them and say, we need your notes, we need to know who your source is, because he's a terrorist. Without any evidence, without any proof. Of course, bravely, most of the journalists say piss off, because, of course, source protection is the holy grail of journalism. We have production orders, where the police go to newspapers and say, here's a production order, give us all your information, which then, the newspapers have to fight. We have injunctions, of course, taken out against the media and against whistleblowers. We have super injunctions where the newspapers can't even mention there's an injunction in place. We have public interest immunity certificates, which is the government version of an injunction. These are effectively gagging orders saying that you cannot print this story. And in fact, during David Shayler's trial, PIIs were issued by the Home and Foreign Secretary, which banned the press from reporting for the 6 weeks of the trial anything to do with the Gaddafi plot, even though it had been widely reported all over the media for the preceding number of years, because they didn't want the jury reading at the time that David Shayler's motivation might have been the Gaddafi plot. So the media tried to fight this, and they failed. What else do we have? We have this wonderful committee, which is made up of volunteer senior journalists and senior intelligence and military figures, called the Defence Press Advisory Committee. It used to be called the D-Notice Committee, and it's notorious on Fleet Street, because this is effectively media self-censorship. You get the great and the good saying, well, we have this story about an operation, but we're going to place a D-Notice on it, and we're going to ban the press from reporting it. And this is voluntary. It's not legal. This is voluntary. But again, it's all part of chaps in the establishment. And finally, of course, we have the notorious 1989 Official Secrets Act, which is not just there to prevent whistleblowers, because, of course, technically, as an intelligence officer, you cannot say anything about your work in MI5 ever to anyone outside MI5, otherwise you go to prison for 2 years. It also covers journalists. And I think this is unique in most so-called democracies, where a journalist, if they report information from a whistleblower and it causes what they call damage to national security, can also go to prison for 2 years. It's the Section 5 of the Official Secrets Act. When I was in Kiev at the recent Global Investigative Journalist Conference, there was a fascinating talk from 2 Russian journalists who had investigated the FSB. And they said, well, of course, whistleblowers from the FSB will get prosecuted and sent to prison. But we don't. There is no legal penalty against journalists in Russia if they expose whistleblowing. So I think that shows into sharp relief the state of British legal democracy, even compared to Russia. We are more draconian when it comes to exposing information in the public interest. So that's the sort of the way I see the media operating. Now, what can we do as a community to protect potential whistleblowers? Because just think, there's so much crap going on in the world out there at the moment, with all these wars and economic meltdown, whatever. There's probably many, many people sitting behind their desks as I speak, thinking, what am I going to do about this? This is terrible. Should I go public? What can I do to stop this? Now, how does a whistleblower find a journalist? How are they going to make that decision? And I suggest you as journalists, one of the best ways is to build up that profile. Make sure you are the person writing about with the expertise, with the credibility and integrity on your chosen subject, so that if there is someone sitting behind a desk saying, for example, I need to expose this story about torture of terrorist suspects, they look through the national media and they find you are the one writing about that sort of subject repeatedly, accurately, with integrity, and they will come to you. And that's how whistleblowers tend to find people. And I think if you do get that fateful phone call from, hey, it's Mike from MI5, I need to talk to somebody, how do you then protect your source? What do you do? Because especially in this high-tech world, with this surveillance society, it's becoming incredibly difficult to keep your sources safe. And this comes down to some sort of basic spycraft, I suppose. If you do get that wonderful phone call, go and meet them. Get a phone number, go and meet them, and then take 2 brand new, cheap mobile telephones and program in your numbers, and you only ever use those phones to call each other. Keep it absolutely safe like that. Never meet in the same place twice. Always set up your next meeting at that meeting, so you don't have to say on electronic communication where you're going to be meeting next time. Always choose a different place. Hotel rooms are great. If you can check in with cash, no paper trail, no credit card, no nothing, that's a good secret place to meet, especially if there's no pre-warning. You just walk in and book the room. So again, there's no sort of electronic lead to where you might be meeting this person. And also be aware of the legalities around communications and the interception of communications in your own countries. So, for example, in the UK, we have this Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which governs communication intercept. Now, that means that they can listen in to telephone conversations, and they will know what you're deciding to do, so you're giving away your strategy, you're giving away the information. But they can't prosecute either of you for whatever information, whatever you say on the phone. However, if they have put a property bug somewhere near where you're holding that telephone conversation, then that end of the telephone conversation can be used as evidence against you in a court of law. So it's just little tricks like that, again, you need to look at if you're managing a source, especially a source coming from the inside of government or intelligence or the military, where you will potentially feel the full force of the intelligence agencies coming after you. And of course, in terms of property bugs, that means don't talk in your own flat, don't talk from your usual workspace at work, because there might be something in your computer or around your desk. Don't talk in your car, because it's very, very easy to bug your cars and follow your cars. So always just think about the basic steps of how to keep, one, your story safe, but more importantly, your source safe. Because don't forget, a whistleblower will, well, if you're a journalist covering a whistleblower, you will make your career potentially on the back of this story, but the whistleblower will be breaking theirs. So you need to as well just think of that sort of humane aspect, that sort of pastoral care that you can offer this person. It's not just a case, and I've seen this time and time again, where ruthless journalists can go in, asset strip the whistleblower for information. There's a big media storm, and then the whistleblower is left high and dry. I mean, really, you know, it's not just a case of potentially losing your job and your income for the whistleblower. You probably will lose most of your social circle, because they're going to be your work colleagues. You will potentially lose your house because you can't afford to pay it. You won't be able to get another equally well-paid job anywhere else, but you become a sort of blacklisted person. And, of course, potentially they are facing prison or a massive fine. So their whole way of life is going to be turned inside out. And being aware of that sort of mentality of what makes someone want to go public, and being humane in dealing with that person as they go public, and also aftercare once they've gone public, is very, very important. Especially, I think, now we're in a sort of WikiLeaks, post-WikiLeaks type world. Because here, this is a sort of heaven-sent opportunity for any whistleblower to try and not turn their entire life inside out, where you have a situation which either WikiLeaks or a similarly secure system in the future means that as a whistleblower, you can be sitting at your desk and you can get information out there with no apparent risk to yourself. Because let's bear in mind, nobody has been outed because of a technical failure of WikiLeaks. I mean, Bradley Manning, the poor man, appears to have outed himself. So there's a whistleblower sitting in the CIA or in MI5 at the moment, potentially thinking, what am I going to do about this? If I were in that position now, my temptation would be initially to go to WikiLeaks at least. One, because it's secure, you can see what the reaction is before you out yourself, if you choose to do that. And two, because any crucial documents will not be lost, will not be handed over to the police with production orders. will not be shredded or, hidden or whatever. They will be out there to prove what you're saying as and when you choose to go properly public. So I think now the old-style media, the old-style source management has got competition from this. And, the tech of WikiLeaks is not going to go away. The technological genie is out of the bottle and will continue to be there, tempting whistleblowers. So really, as journalists, you need to think of the sort of added value that you bring to the process, because whistleblowers are going to be paranoid about the security that you use. They're going to be paranoid about the security within your organization and the linkages at higher levels between you and perhaps the people they're blowing the whistle on. So they're going to be very, very cautious. So what do you as journalists bring to the table as opposed to just being able to leak something to WikiLeaks? I think in terms of the motivation of whistleblowers, that's where the key added value can come from. Because it's very easy to leak a piece of information, but a whistleblower quite often will go into that sort of job, say military or the government or intelligence, wanting to make a difference, and that's the same motivation they will then bring to the whistleblowing table. I want to blow the whistle on this because this is so invidious, I have to make a difference with this. And then quite often they will want to add their name to that so that they can have a public profile and continue to speak out about that issue from an informed perspective. They're the ones who know what they're talking about. And they need the support to carry on the fight and pressure from the media to back them, to call for an inquiry. If someone's really taken the time and the effort and the risk to out that sort of information, they deserve the support and the media storm and the push for government accountability or a change of the law or whatever it is. So that's really, that and the security and the sort of humane pastoral care, particularly post-whistleblowing, is, I think, what the older media style rather than WikiLeaks can still bring to the table. So just to finish, really, why is this so important at the moment? I'm sure there will be multitudes of people sitting out there thinking about exposing stuff. There's so much coming out, even to this day. Only last week in Germany, which is where I now live, there was a massive scandal where it emerged that there were some agents being run into extreme right-wing groups in Germany by the intelligence agencies, who were being paid by these intelligence agencies. And it was the agents who seemed to be building up and keeping going these extremist groups. So it's almost like they're creating jobs for their bosses to keep investigating. But it got worse, because it turned out that 3 of these agents had been involved in a killing spree over the last few years. They were serial killers. They'd been shooting Turkish immigrants. They'd killed, I think, 10 or 11 people. And this linkage, this sort of dirty linkage between intelligence agencies and political groups and their targets, and the covering up of crimes of that magnitude in order to allow, to keep your sources, your agents safe, it just stinks. It stinks. So stuff keeps coming out, and it's those sort of dirty interlinkages that we keep needing to expose. I just really want to finish with one thought about the importance of getting these stories out. And I'm going back to Libya now. As I said, the original whistleblowing started because of this Gaddafi plot, way back in 1995, 1996, where, just to recap, we have a situation. MI6 is paying the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group money to try and oust Colonel Gaddafi. It's offering support, practical support. It's running agents into that group to try and kill Colonel Gaddafi of Libya. And it's kept utterly secret, and it's not even covered by UK law because they didn't want to take it to the Foreign Secretary for permission. Roll forward to this year. Suddenly, I'm sure you can see the parallels. We have Western-backed forces coming from Benghazi, which tend to be the old royalist stronghold, plus the Islamist stronghold, where MI6 and the other British forces and NATO forces are pumping money and equipment and support and help and advice to the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, amongst others, who then go and kill Gaddafi. But this is all done flagrantly in the full glare of the media. So that shift from skullduggery in the dark to actually thinking they can get away with it and actually being able to get away with it in the full glare of daylight now says, I think, a lot about the moral journey we as citizens, as countries, have taken in the last decade since 9/11, and this huge sort of terrorist flap and this build-up of this security infrastructure where we've got these endless wars on terror and we all have to be frightened and live under surveillance societies. I don't think there has ever been a greater need for whistleblowers. I don't think there's ever been a greater need for really good, hardcore investigative journalism into these sort of areas. It's a case of holding power to account. And I'll just finish with that very famous quote, which I love, which is, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And that's what we've all got to do more and more. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie.
Thank you very much. Questions?
And you're ready to take questions,
Yeah.
I know. Please, yes. And tell your name, yes, please.
Mm-hmm. Well, in Britain, the question is, how much? How do they communicate? I mean, what sort of information do they put out there? Well, they didn't officially exist until '89, so they never put anything out to anyone. After that, they were subject to the Intelligence Services Act in 1994. Now, this not only regulated MI6 and GCHQ, it also created something called the Intelligence and Security Committee in Parliament, which was supposed to be this notion of oversight. Now, I was in the services at the time, and they were really indignant at the idea of parliamentarians and getting to know anything about what they did. And then they were really, really pleased at the terms of the ISC, because it was so pathetic. So the ISC is only appointed by the Prime Minister. It only reports to the Prime Minister, and its findings are vetted by the Prime Minister. So nothing ever comes out meaningfully from them. And they can only look at policy, finance, and administration. So they've got no powers to investigate crime. They've got no powers to look at operations. They can't demand papers, and they can't cross-examine witnesses under oath. So they are toothless. So any information that officially comes out via them, and that's not very much every year at all. In fact, their annual report is a joke, because more of it's asterisked out than is actually in words. And there have been many, many scandals over the last decade of how much they have been effectively lied to by senior spooks. So, for example, Stephen Lander, the charm-offensive head of MI5, has gone public and said he blanches now at what he didn't tell them in the early days of his leadership in MI5. We've had senior policemen from the Metropolitan Police Special Branch lying to them, and when they are exposed by the press for lying to them, they said, well, I'm terribly sorry, we just misled you, it wasn't a lie. I mean, what's the difference? And also, Dame Eliza Manning and Buller, who was the former head of MI5 during the time of 9/11 and after that, gave evidence saying, of course we don't get involved in torture. No, we don't do that. And now, of course, the current head, Jonathan Evans, has had to go to the ISC and say, yes, actually we have, and there's all this evidence. So, yes, they can lie, and the parliamentarians have no way of knowing. It's a bit like the cover-up of the Bishopsgate. They just don't know. How can they know? Even when they are applied to for warrants to get permission to bug someone's phone, all they see is a summary of a summary of a summary of a summary. They never see any raw information. So they always like to say, oh, yes, we know everything. We know they're obeying the law, until it's inconvenient for them to do so. Recently, with the torture allegations that came out of Libya, interestingly, Jack Straw, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time of these torture renditions of Abdel Hakim Belhaj and Abu Muntir, said, well, yes, I was Foreign Secretary, but I don't know what they get up to. I can't be expected to know everything that MI6 does. Well, I'm sorry, mate. You're supposed to be the democratically accountable boss of MI6 at that time. You should at least know if they're getting involved in big policy shifts like involvement in torture. So they want it every which way. But, of course, they lie, because they can get away with it. That's the simple answer. And they continue to get away with it, and it's getting worse. And can I just make one little point as well on that Belhaj thing? I mean, how many of you are familiar with this story? There's this guy who was kidnapped, extraordinarily rendered, and taken to Tripoli in 2004 and tortured. He was handed over to the Gaddafi regime and tortured terribly for 6 years. Now, this guy was a member of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group that had been backed by MI6 in the 1996 coup, and had been backed up until about 9/11, when the gloves came off, of course. So he thinks he's a friend of MI6. Then MI6, after 9/11, cozies up to Colonel Gaddafi and kidnaps him and takes him and gives him to Colonel Gaddafi, where he's tortured. Now, roll forward a few years. Ironically, this guy is now the head military commander of the Libyan rebel forces, or the new Libyan forces in Tripoli. And he is suing the British government for torture. So effectively, what we have here is MI6 damaging our national security and damaging the economic well-being of the UK, because this guy is now mooted as a potential prime minister, not just a military commander. So we've got someone who has been betrayed twice by MI6, who might now be the new head of Libya. So do you think MI6 has really helped, juicy oil contracts for the British government in the future and things? They just create a mess, and they think they can get away with it, double dealing time and time again, and nobody will ever know, and then they will get caught out. So, sorry, that was a bit of a rant. Keep it shorter next time.
No, it's okay. Thank you, boy. You're next.
Ooh.
Please, please.
My name is Eva Young. I'm of the Berlingske. I'm just interested in knowing what happened after you blew the whistle about the Mossad bombing. What happened to the two Palestinians?
Yeah.
Did they have any trial?
No, the whole story around the Israeli embassy bombing is really, really sad. I mean, for the whistleblower and for the poor victims as well. When David went public, the newspaper only did the low-level allegations, and an injunction was taken out against the mainstream media in August 1997. Come November 1997, the Mail on Sunday already has this information and decides to challenge the injunction by submitting it to government and saying, we want to publish this. So the government looks at it and tweaks it a bit and lets them publish it. And then the Home Secretary, Jack Straw, again, he's a lovely guy, Jack Straw, goes forward and says, you could see how, based on the information available, David Shaler, a low-ranking officer, could have misinterpreted, what the guy in MI5 was saying. Well, actually, if David Shaler, whatever, could have misinterpreted that information from those documents, so could a jury if those documents had ever been put in front of the original trial, and they weren't. So MI5 was sitting on this information, and that's why it was a mistrial. And that's why the blowing the whistle should immediately have led to the release of these two, pending a retrial. Now, what happened was, this was when we were hiding in a French farmhouse and negotiating with the government. So the lawyers of Alawi and Botme go to the government and say, we think they need to be released, they should have a retrial with this information put in. And the government just refuses to do anything about it because they're trying to just forget about David and let him rot abroad. Then, of course, there's a big scandal in 1998 when he exposes the Gaddafi plot. He's arrested and put in prison awaiting extradition. And it seemed certain on legal advice that he would be extradited from France. The lawyers and the government all said this. So it looked like what was happening was the government was waiting for David to get back into the UK, to be put on remand in prison awaiting trial for breach of the Official Secrets Act. Only then would they address the Israeli embassy case again, because once they'd got David safely in prison and convicted, then it wouldn't have mattered if there'd been a victory for the whistleblower in establishing the innocence of the two Israeli embassy suspects. This is quite a convoluted story, but it looked like basically they were slowing the whole case down until they got the result they wanted with David, which was conviction in prison, and then they would review the Israeli embassy case. Now, as soon as David was not extradited from France, suddenly the lawyers realised, it's not going to plan. They have to start talking to the Israeli embassy, two lawyers, one of whom was Gareth Pearce, who's a most wonderful, famous human rights lawyer in the UK, who always deals with the difficult cases. Anyway, at that point, the government says, yes, we do need to allow an appeal against what might be a wrongful conviction. And the information is acknowledged within the appeal that, yes, these documents did exist and could have been misconstrued by the jury, could have been taken by the jury to show evidence. But the judges just decided to ignore the case law. They just said, well, sorry, that's it. You're not seeing the documents per se. We're acknowledging they exist, but that's it. We're not going to give them to you because of national security. So they lose their appeal. The lawyer takes them, tries to get them a hearing at the next level, and the judicial system refuses to allow them to go to a higher court. So they then just sit in prison until they're released. So it was stunning. I mean, there was a huge scandal again. There were lots of people, journalists writing about this, saying, how can they just ignore case law? They're ignoring European human rights law as well, which was by then incorporated into UK law. And they just got away with it somehow. It was power play. I don't know. I mean, I just feel so sad for those two. I mean, they were broken. They were imprisoned for 15 years each for something they didn't do, and which MI5 knew they didn't do. But they wouldn't admit it, because then it would have been victory to a whistleblower, vindication for the process of whistleblowing. So
Now, next question. Oh, can't be true. Yes, please.
My name is Selina Osman, and I'm from a magazine for social housing. And you insinuated that there might be some agents within the Danish media as well. So how do you spot these agents, and how do you identify their agendas?
I wasn't trying to insinuate. I was trying to describe what happens definitely for sure in the UK media. But I'm sure, you know, the systems of leverage and the carrot and the stick probably do apply elsewhere. It's difficult. I mean, I suppose one of the things is to look at who seems to get the easy scoops from certain departments, certain government agencies or something like that. If they get these stories, do they then question them and investigate them a little bit more? Or if, for example, you're working for a big newspaper that has a track record of doing a lot of information, a lot of stories, say, on intelligence or the wars or whatever, do suddenly some of these stories get spiked or spun or changed at the last minute as they're going through the process? I mean, it's just little things like that might indicate that someone somewhere is telling tales. And, you know, it's often not malignant, I don't think, by the person. They probably think they're doing something good, which is helping out their chums in the agencies because they're friends of theirs, or, you know, they're protecting national security or whatever. But I think it's a very dangerous path to go down for a journalist, to get entangled with the people they should be investigating rather than holding them to account. But I don't think there's any surefire way. I mean, I have met other journalists who say, well, I think so-and-so might be. What do you suggest? And it's really just to watch for those patterns, I think, of easy stories, no questioning. If something more difficult comes up, is it sort of shunted out of the way, that sort of thing.
Yeah. You mentioned that when you were warned that they were going to run the story in 3 days, they offered you to pay some expenses. Do you think news organizations should pay whistleblowers?
No, I don't think you should ever pay for that sort of story, absolutely not. As I said, this was something David had been negotiating with the newspaper for over a year, saying, let's get this story out, let's do it this way, let's do it this way. No mention of money whatsoever for that entire period. But it's only when they suddenly realised quite how short a notice we had and quite how big the story was going to be, they said, well, you want to get out of the country? We'll help you for a bit. During the negotiations, one of the things we negotiated via the lawyers was, well, if you let us back to the country, we won't need this money. We'll pay you whatever we spent back. We won't need anything else. You know, we didn't want it for that. But it didn't stop some of the more malign newspapers saying, shameless old agent lies down the river for money. And that's where that story came from, really. So I think it's a very difficult one, because we didn't want to sit around in our flat waiting for that knock on the door from the secret police and then get hauled off on remand for 2 years. So we wanted to go. And I think, actually, if Princess Diana hadn't fatefully died that night in Paris, the whole story would have been very, very different. It would have escalated much more quickly, and it would have come to a resolution much more quickly. It was just unfortunate timing.
So basically, the answer is no.
No, I don't believe in checkbook journalism at all. I mean, I think you might get certain information that way, but the motivation's wrong. And I think also, I was trying to describe as well, the difference between leakers going anonymously to WikiLeaks or whatever, and someone who is actually willing to put their name to an article or a disclosure, because by doing that they can then fight for that issue and really push it and do more interviews and really say, this is why I'm doing this, because of this issue, this issue, this issue. We need to have an inquiry. We need potentially to change the laws that govern these agencies. That's when you need that sort of motivation, which is the whistleblower motivation to do this, to make a change. And you're not going to get that from checkbook journalism. But, of course, if you do have someone falling into your lap who wants to really do that campaigning role afterwards, you do need very careful, humane, pastoral care as well. You know, not just getting the story and running.
More questions? Yes?
My name is Ingrid Christensen from my local paper, Berlingske. Could you please tell a bit about how has your life been after this whole whistleblowing, and what do you do as a job now?
Job? What's that? What do I do now? What's my life been like? Well, it was a roller coaster, really. I mean, very frightening, very frightening, actually, for the first few years, and very sort of traumatizing. I mean, watching your partner being shredded in the newspapers and attacked baselessly, and it makes you very angry as well. I mean, he had a very strong support around him as well. But yes, I mean, it's very difficult. I used to joke that when you step outside that sort of work, it's like being a Victorian fallen woman. You know, once you've taken that fateful step, there's no going back to normal life. And I suppose I try and use the knowledge I gathered, I try and use the skills I gathered around that time as well to carry on, you know, doing work like this. I mean, I do a lot of public speaking. I do a lot of political campaigning around certain issues, particularly things like civil liberties and the sort of dangerous slide towards surveillance states that I can see in a number of our countries. I also write occasionally. I do reviews, I do media commentary, whatever. I mean, it's the sort of ultimate freelance life, which I'm sure many of you will sympathise with. So it's been difficult, but I mean, all I can say, I suppose, is not regret. Just look back and think, well, this happened, and I learnt this, and this is happening, so I'll learn that, and take the best of it as you can. But yeah, it's a tricky one.
We are still ahead of schedule here, please.
Yes, my name is Sebastian. I'm from Sebastian Møller from local TV here. I'm sure a lot of conspiracy theorists already asked you. Do you think there's a link between Diana's death and the story?
Yeah, it's everyone's favourite conspiracy theory, isn't it? There was a link I can tell you about, but I don't think it points to any sort of culpability one way or the other. Well, I don't know. Yes, we were, by the time, yeah, her story knocked us out of the paper, so we lost all protection that we had from our media at the time. Then we end up hiding in this little French farmhouse in the middle of nowhere with no car, no shops apart from 2 miles away. I mean, it's really quite primitive. And the only person who's got our telephone number is David's lawyer, who's the head of Liberty. He rang up one day saying, I've had this strange request. Mohammed Al-Fayed's head of security would like to see you in Paris, please. I was like, what? Then, okay. So one morning, this black Ritz Mercedes, you know, similar model to the one that wiped out Dodi and Diana in Paris, comes down, picks us up, takes us off to Paris, 3-hour drive. And we are taken to the flat on the Champs-Élysées, where we meet this head of security. And he says, well, we'd just like you to have a quick look at these documents we've been offered. And they looked like telegrams, telexes, between the CIA and MI6, plotting the murder of Princess Diana. And he said, well, do you think they're genuine? Because we've been offered these documents for sale for $20 million. And if they're genuine, we'll buy them and we'll use them to expose the fact they were plotting to murder Diana. So we looked at them, and they were very, very good forgeries. But they were forgeries because just basic things like the date timeline couldn't exist in the way they had it. And they referred to MI6 in the wrong way. I mean, it was always known as Vauxhall Cross, not MI6 and things like that. So just about 5 different minor things made it very obvious it was fake. But the interesting thing was that the guy trying to offer these documents for sale was a guy called Oswald Lewinter, who was a known CIA and MI6 asset, someone who sort of floated around the fringes of the intelligence world doing little odd jobs for them. And he was quite notorious. So you have this situation where this person, potentially with linkages to the intelligence agencies, is offering these papers to Al-Fayed. Now, of course, if he had bought them and gone to the world's press saying, look, I've got proof, CIA and MI6 tried to murder Diana, and then someone had turned around and said, yes, but they're very good forgeries, nobody would ever have listened to him ever again after that. It's the classic straw man technique. So we did wonder, even if it was just after the event, if there was some interest or linkage. But beyond that, I don't know. I keep my mind open to everything, should we say. It'd be naive not to. No, I mean, I think some of the timing was interesting, because I do remember there was reporting around the time, wasn't there, that she was not only involved in the landmine campaigns, but she was beginning to support the Palestinian campaign as well. I don't know. Who knows? I try and avoid theories and just stick to what I know.
One final question. Yes, please.
Hi,
Hello. Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering with these injunctions, these super injunctions, in this new media world, would it be interesting for you as a whistleblower to leak documents to foreign media, to New York Times, Spiegel, or whatever, to avoid these super injunctions?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, if I was British, would I leak abroad? Well, in fact, that did happen because of the injunction against Shaler in the British media. When he was imprisoned in Paris, the newspaper and Panorama programme wanted to run the Gaddafi plot and came up against the injunction. So someone somewhere leaked the story to the New York Times. Once it was in the New York Times, of course, it could be then reported in the UK media. So, yes, it has been done. I think sometimes the difficulty is cultural because you don't know who to approach. You don't know the environment and who might be trustworthy, who might not, who might, for example, go to the head of the BND, who then goes to the head of MI6. It's difficult enough doing it in your own country. So if you haven't got good links abroad and you don't know the rules of the game, it's even more frightening. And then, of course, you've got the electronic communications issues as well to think about. But yes, that is one way around it, and it's a very effective way around it. So, yeah, that might be something as journalists. You could all think, hey, we're here, come and leak to us. I would say as well, my partner Ian is here. He's an expert on some of those tech issues and encryption and how you can protect yourself electronically if you get sources that you need to handle and protect. So I know he's around if you wanted a quick word on some of those sort of issues later.
He will be on.
Perfect.
He will have a later on.
Okay.
Thank you.